Hey fearsome friends, it's time again for a Let's Not Meet episode, my favourite. From knife-wielding children, creepy people out at night, and abusive family members, brace yourself for some truly scary stories. So sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. I, a female and 26, needed gas and it was around 11 p.m. on a Saturday night. I pulled into a busy gas station to fill my tank up and it was completely bare with not a car in sight. Now I live in Alaska, so that night was very cold at maybe -10. Being tired from work and just wanting to get home, usually I'd start my pump and sit in the car due to the freezing cold. But this time I had a weird feeling. I felt as if I needed to stand by the pump this time, so I did. Just then, as I'd started pumping my gas, a little golden sedan pulled up right next to me. A guy got out and I was feeling hypervigilant for some reason. He proceeded to clean his completely clean windows, and as he put back the squeegee, he started on his way towards me. I wanted to run but stayed calm and continued pumping. He asked me if I would help him put some windshield wiper fluid in his car because he'd run out and he didn't know how to open the hood. I laughed it off and told him that I didn't know either, which was a lie, but he kept getting closer and closer to me whilst trying to lure me into his car by saying there was something under his seat he couldn't reach because he's too big. Now I'm 5'2" and petite, and this man was large and scruffy. Think Alaskan wilderness dude. At this point I was freaking out and hit the call button on the pump. He took a step back and started to go back to his car, and I thought I was being smart. My gas was almost done. Then I looked in his car and noticed there were no handles on the insides of the doors, except for the driver's door. Seeing that really freaked me out. As I was putting the pump back and opening my door, he was suddenly right behind me, and he slammed my door shut, yelling, "You're coming with me." Obviously I refused and I was petrified as he grabbed my arm and slammed me against my car. I elbowed him as hard as I could and started to scream at the top of my lungs. Thank goodness for the gas station attendant that had a big-ass gun, because if it were not for him, I don't know what would have happened. The attendant pulled the security video out and we made a police report. I called immediately after the guy had gone, but I never heard anything else about it. I just hope he didn't get some other girl alone. So to the guy with no door handles, let's not meet. My name is Jasmine and I live in Essonne. I'm going to tell you a story that happened to me back in January 2021, when I had been working full-time at McDonald's for around 3 months, and a very good friend of mine had just started working there with me. It was a Thursday night in the middle of the curfew period, and my friend and I were working, but not at the same time, so we each took our cars separately. After our shifts around 10 p.m, we spent the rest of the evening at a friend's house who lived a 5-minute drive from the restaurant, and another friend joined us there. Around 1 a.m, my friend and I decided to go home because we were under curfew and our work certificate was valid only until 1:30 a.m, when the last employees could finish. So we each took our car and our friend who had joined jumped in my car so I could drop him at his place that was just next door. Whilst dropping him at the roundabout, we finished our discussion and he grabbed his stuff. And as it was a weeknight at 1 a.m. and in the middle of curfew, the streets were totally empty, except for my friend in their car behind me. We continued on our way with her behind me, and we were supposed to put in less than 10 minutes to return home, as we don't live very far from each other. After 2 minutes of the journey, we took a departmental road just after the exit of the city, and it's a road that we take often when it's rush hour and the main route is blocked. It's a long straight road with no light, and on the right is a big forest. On the left was a smaller forest, and behind it there is the River Seine. There's also somewhere to park up on the left if you need to. On this particular evening, it had rained for a few hours earlier, so the ground was wet and it was very dark. The road we were on is also a single-lane way, so I put my headlights on full, and I could see that there were no cars. A few seconds later, though, all of a sudden, I saw headlights shining bright and coming towards me. The oncoming car suddenly accelerated and was now right in front of me. Then the driver opened his door, which then blocked my way. What I found immediately strange, though, was that I hadn't seen this car at first. It had just appeared from nowhere. Otherwise I would have seen it from far away, and I would never have turned on my headlights. So this car had either suddenly come out of the forest, or it was already on the road and had turned on its lights when it saw me put on mine. A lady then came out of the car, who was dressed rather normally in jeans, a sweater and a scarf. But she had a very marked face. Her hair was tangled and dry, as if she had not washed it for months, and she just really looked like a drug addict. She came to my door, so I lowered my window. But with my paranoid mind, I said to myself that I would only lower it a little, as to protect myself. I don't want to give her the chance to be able to take my keys out of the ignition, or my phone, which was between my legs, and especially not be able to open my door from the inside. She watched me roll down my window, and the first thing she said to me in a very calm tone was, "Can you hear me?" It was already really strange, because she'd seen me lower my window and my music, so logically she knew that I could hear her. I answered that yes, I could, without really understanding what was going on, when suddenly she began crying and talking in a very panicked way, and then said, "Excuse me, I have to go and get my children from the door of Vitry. They're at their father's and he's crazy. It's not going well at all. I have to go and get them quickly, but I have no more fuel and my card isn't working. Please help me. Can you park up and come with me to get some gas with your card?" she asked. I told her clearly no, and then she said, "You don't have some cash you can give to me?" During all of this I felt really bad, and said to myself that it would be rude for me to just leave, especially as it was in the middle of curfew. Nobody else was going to pass by here, and it was dark. There were really no reassuring conditions. So while I was listening to what she was telling me, I told myself that I had to find a way to make her close her door, which was still blocking my way, and my girlfriend was still behind me, who later told me that at the beginning she thought I was messing around, and that she almost got out of her car to come and see what was going on. I said to myself that I would tell the woman to go and ask my colleague in the car behind me to see if she had any cash to help, hoping she would then close her door and let me out. Then in the meantime I would call my friend and tell her not to roll down her window, and we'd get out of there pronto. So I told the woman to go to my friend, and she stopped crying, looking panicked, and replied with an okay in a very dry tone and a scary look. As I hoped, she closed her door, and then went to my friend behind me. I tried to call her several times, but she didn't answer, and the woman had already reached her car. I was watching from my rearview mirror. I didn't know what to do now, so I just moved forward a little to pass the woman's car, which by the way was covered with pieces of tape here and there. I wanted to pass the car completely to be sure I could get away, and I remember then looking into the car, and there I saw a man in the passenger side who had very long hair and piercings. Then in the back there was another man who was bald with a long goatee and was covered in piercings too. Next to him was a dog with both paws resting on the window, and these two men also had very marked faces, probably because of whatever drugs they'd been taking. The two men and the dog followed me with their eyes as I passed, and then our eyes met. I was terrified, and it confirmed my uneasy vibes. Passing the car, I got to where I was no longer in their field of vision. Then I looked in my rearview mirror at the woman who was still talking to my friend. I tried calling her again in vain, but she still wasn't answering. So instead I decided to call my boyfriend and tell him where I was and with who and what was going on. I figured there should be at least one person who knows where I am, just in case anything happens. I also thought it'd be a good idea to take a picture of the car from my rearview mirror. So I took the photo and saw that the woman was coming back to my car. I looked at the photo I'd taken, and unfortunately it hadn't picked up the license plate. The lady was now back at my window, and I see that my friend had started inching forward, so I knew then she understood something strange was going on. At that same moment I heard the woman yelling at me when she realized I was moving forward too. Then I did what I'd been waiting to do from the beginning, and drove like I'd never driven before. When she saw I was getting away, she yelled, "You come back!" Then she turned around and saw that my friend was going at full speed too. So she ran to get into her car and start chasing us. At this moment, finally my friend calls me and said, "That was super weird." I told her to just follow me behind and said that we were going to go to my house. Now just to note that you need to have a badge to enter my neighborhood, and if you don't have one, then you are to call a neighbor so that they can open up for you. We eventually reached my house, but were too scared to get out of our cars. So we sat there for 10 minutes, parked next to each other and on the phone, talking about what had just happened. My friend slept at my place that night because there was no way she was driving home alone with those crazies out there. Once we'd calmed down a bit, we went inside and didn't even think about calling the police, as we were still so scared. Going over the events together, we realized some things. That the woman in question had given us the exact same scenario, as if it had been planned and rehearsed, right down to her saying, "Can you hear me?" Also because my friend had whizzed past the woman's car following me, she hadn't noticed the guys inside. She broke down when I told her about them. We never found out who these people were, and we discussed the events of that night with a few other people. We came to several other possibilities on what they were up to. Theft of money and cards, or even our vehicles. But on a more frightening note, it might have been an attempted kidnapping. Whatever reason it was, the fact that she'd initially wanted us to get into her car, knowing that in there were already 2 men and a dog, makes my blood run cold. When I told this story to one of my cousins who lives at the end of the city in a complex just before the main street, he told me that not far from his house, there are abandoned buildings where many drug addicts hang out. Since he told me this, I can't help but think that these people might have had another person in on it too, who'd seen me stop at the roundabout dropping my buddy off, and saw that we were just 2 girls alone in their cars. I don't know if I've become too paranoid because of this, and whether we're not the first ones this has happened to, but we avoid taking this road anymore, especially at night. So we all make dumb decisions in life, but in this case I was just downright stupid. I'd arranged to meet a guy from Tinder, but because of my heightened anxiety about driving, I asked him to pick me up outside my place. I had been talking to him for a few weeks by that point, and I know that's not redeemable, but the choice I made on this day could have ended me. Thankfully, I'm still around to tell the tale. So the guy picked me up in his car and told me he'd planned to take us out for sushi. I love sushi, so I thought, great. He put in the name of the restaurant into his GPS and we were off, making pleasant conversation on the way. That is until I began seeing woods instead of restaurants when I looked out my window. I was very confused. We were supposed to be going into town, not into the wilderness in the middle of nowhere, and fear hit me hard then, and he said, "I swear the GPS is taking me through here. I didn't choose this route." "Please just get us back to civilization," I said. My eyes were wide and I must have looked like a deer in headlights. His face was really apprehensive, so he must have known that I was completely scared. Oh my God, I thought to myself. I should have just conquered my anxiety about driving and met him somewhere public. Or better yet, not met with this guy at all. What the hell was I thinking? I'm going to get murdered here in these woods. I tried checking my phone to see if I could assist him with the GPS, and that's when he said those spine-chilling words. "There's no signal out here." I remember thinking to myself to just try to look calm, and don't let him think you suspect him. But man, did I feel terrified. The tips of my fingers were cold whilst I was simultaneously sweating. If he was going to kill me, part of me wanted him to get it over with so I wouldn't be left in anticipation. I could see sweat on his forehead as he kept saying, "I swear I'm not doing this. I'm trying to get us back en route to the sushi place." "I don't care about sushi anymore. Get us to a gas station. Anywhere with people at this point," I said. "I don't have a shovel or weapon in my trunk or anything like that, if that's what you're thinking," he said, which did little to calm my nerves. We thankfully finally reached the restaurant after what felt like an eternity, and I'd never been so scared in my life. I didn't have much of an appetite, and I was physically trembling when we arrived. But I figured he didn't kill me when he had the chance, so I guess it was safe now to continue with our date. I'd already planned on taking an Uber home, because I didn't want to go through that experience again, and I was shocked out of my mind when he then asked, "So when do you think we'll have sex?" I nearly choked on a piece of sashimi. "What?" I didn't know where this was coming from, and I didn't know how he could ask me something like that on our first date, when he'd literally seen me as pale as a ghost only moments ago. "You know, like, how long will you make me wait for sex? A day? A week? A month?" I stared at him dumbfounded and couldn't respond because I was utterly speechless. "Well, I can't wait a whole month, I'm telling you that now," he said. I didn't say anything to that, and the rest of the date was insanely awkward. I said goodbye as I took my Uber home, and only seconds after my driver pulled out of the restaurant parking lot, he texted me to say that he doesn't think it will work out with me because he needs a girl with a higher libido. I didn't argue. I just texted back a simple "okay," ready to be done with this man. When the Uber driver drove me home, he didn't take me through the wilderness pathway of a potential murder site. He took me home through streets, other cars, lights, which was the sweetest scene and an immense relief. I couldn't help but wonder why my date had to take me through an hour drive through the wilderness to get to the restaurant, but it only took the Uber driver 15 minutes to get me home from the same location. The whole thing was chilling. I don't know if my date had planned on anything sinister, or if it was an honest mistake, but I'm glad I made it out alive. I learned a tough lesson that night, one that I should have already known, but that I foolishly ignored for some reason. Don't let strangers from a dating app pick you up in their cars. To the guy who took me through the woods, let's not meet again. Some stories are so creepy that even if you didn't directly experience them, they still manage to haunt you when you're alone at night. This story my mum told me is one of those, and for the sake of anonymity, I'll call her Jill. I need you to imagine for a moment that we are about 30 years in the past when this story took place, in a typical American suburban neighborhood. Picture it in your mind. The houses were closely built, so there were narrow passages between each one, and at this moment in time it was very quiet at around 2 a.m. The air was eerily still, and other than a few flickering lampposts along Jill's street, there wasn't a lot of activity. Yet. Now Jill was single and living alone. She was letting her dog out on an extendable leash in her backyard to do his business, when it just so happened that she had been interrupted mid-sleep cycle by her whining pup. So she obliged, crusty-eyed and barely conscious. Her dog was a fluffy chow-chow named Rupert, and he trotted to the end of the yard towards, and that's when Jill thought she may have been half dreaming, because she then saw the figure of a little boy standing there, staring. He looked to be about 7 years old, and was wearing this long white nightshirt that draped to his calves. It was something reminiscent of a hospital gown, and he looked almost like a ghost. Jill rubbed her eyes and looked again to make sure she wasn't seeing things, and she wasn't. The boy was still there, his dark brown hair dishevelled. He looked very pale with purple shadows under a pair of very glazed eyes. Something jarred at Jill's instincts when she saw those eyes, and she considered that the boy looked strikingly similar to the character Damien from the movie The Omen, which kind of freaked her out, especially given that it was 2 a.m. when she last checked the clock. The boy had an arm extended towards Rupert. At first, Jill assumed innocent intentions. She thought, yeah, it is weird that this kid out is in the middle of the night. But at the same time, he just kind of looked to be petting Rupert, who had taken a seat next to him. Rupert was a very trusting dog, who'd go up to just about anybody and sit by their feet. Now, though the outdoor light was turned on, she hadn't fully registered the object that the kid was holding in his hand, because he was standing partially in the darkness. But it took a moment for her eyes to adjust, before she noticed that he was gripping the handle of an 8-inch chef's knife. Rupert obviously didn't detect the danger, but he was bobbing his head up and down a little, and flinching. That's when she saw that the boy was slowly, rhythmically tapping his head with the point of the knife. Clearly Rupert wasn't hurt, because he was still sitting there, letting the boy continue with the tapping. Jill, on the other hand, was understandably freaked out by this. "Rupert, come," she called to him. She wanted to get her dog inside as fast as possible, but something told her she shouldn't react in a way that might stir the boy. See, he was staring with this clouded look like he was somewhere else in his mind, potentially sleepwalking or something. She worried that if she shouted at him to stop, or if she screamed, that he would wake up from his reverie and do something even worse with the knife. "Rupert, come here, boy." She spoke softly again. She tugged on the leash to pull him to her, and Rupert complied after a couple of tugs. Once he was safely inside, she immediately closed the door behind him and locked it. It was one of those glass-styled doors, so she could see when the boy had silently approached it, and tried to trigger the handle to follow Rupert inside. After a failed attempt to come inside, he started tapping the point of the knife against the glass in the same, slow, repetitive motion that he was using when he tapped Rupert's head. He continued to have that glazed look on his face, this expression void of life. Jill was quietly watching in fearful silence, still trying to register what was happening. And after a short moment, the boy stopped trying Jill's door and walked over to the next-door neighbor's house, where an older lady lived. Because there were no backyard fences, Jill saw as the boy staggered slowly to the back door of the woman's house, and she could actually hear him jostling the handle, making an effort to break in. Oh my God, what if my neighbor opens her back door to this kid? Jill thought. Panic raced through her. She dialed the police and explained the situation. "There's a little boy outside. He has a knife and is alone. There are no adults around. He's just out alone." "Are you safe?" the operator asked. "Yeah, I'm in my house." The operator informed her that police were on their way. Then the sound of a car pulling up to her other neighbor's front driveway alerted her. She felt obligated to warn her arriving neighbor about the boy running loose around the neighborhood, wielding a knife. So she ran out of her front door and anxiously greeted the man, who was a pretty big dude, tall and muscular. Part of her was concerned for his personal safety, but another part of her felt some relief, as maybe he could help overpower the boy and take the knife away from him. The man looked at her, seeming a bit confused about why he was being approached outside his house this late. So Jill was trying to reason in her mind what she was going to say to him. It was hard for her to form words, as she was, after all, still having trouble comprehending it herself. Watch out for this kid? The words sounded kind of silly in her head. Hey, be careful, there's a little boy with a... But before she could finish her sentence, the little boy appeared around the corner, emerging from the dark passageway between their two homes. She gasped, the panic suddenly in her throat. The kid, she screamed. But it was too late. The boy immediately started lunging after them, and he still looked somewhat unaware as he maneuvered, his eyes glazed over yet intent, as he thrusted the knife in heavy but silent stabbing motions. He looked very possessed-like. "What the hell?" the man shouted, dodging the child's blow. "Whose kid is this?" Jill and her neighbour swiveled around his car, using it as a protective barrier to put some space in between them and the boy. Then Jill noticed as the knife glistened in the glowing light of the street lamps, it was exactly like some scene in a horror movie. She couldn't believe this was actually happening outside of a film set. "Is he yours?" the man asked her, his voice raised in anger and fear. "No." Their exchange was torn a lot between "be careful" and "whose kid is this?" And they were absolutely terrified and screaming as the boy chased the two around the car. They kept running from his stabbing attempts in a mad frenzy, and the boy's movements were very sporadic and unpredictable. He moved sluggishly, but would suddenly jolt in quick bursts of short movements. "Oh my God!" Jill screamed when he would suddenly dash for seconds at a time without any warning. In a bold maneuver, the man made a swift motion towards the attacker, lifting his leg to try to kick the knife out from the boy's grip. He did this a few times, taking steps back to dodge each blow in between kicks. He was a big dude, but even still, he was grunting under his breath, struggling to find the right pattern in the boy's attack to kick him without getting stabbed. Jill didn't see or hear the knife drop at all during this struggle, so she used the earliest opportunity whilst the boy was distracted to run like hell back to her house. From there, she saw through the window as her neighbour abandoned his attempt, and adrenaline must have taken over him, because he leapt over the top of his car like some sort of stuntman from an action movie and sprinted to the front door of his house to safety. While peering out through her window, a chill ran down Jill's spine when she suddenly realised she couldn't see the boy anymore. The kid had vanished. Sometime in the scuffle of running, screaming and watching her neighbour, she'd lost sight of the boy and his knife. This was more terrifying to her than when she had eyes on him and knew where he was. Then, Jill suddenly felt so on edge that any light tapping noise made her jolt. She squealed at the slightest sound, even the low thudding of Rupert's paws against her tile kitchen floor. And soon, even the sound of her own breathing was enough to startle her. It was the longest, most intense moment of her life. When she finally saw a police car pull up in front of her house, she felt safe enough to cautiously walk outside to greet the officer. She waved to him, and the man in uniform looked to her questioningly. "I'm the one who called," she told him. "What are we looking for?" "A little boy." "What does he look like?" He's about 3.5 feet tall, I think." She was still grappling with what had happened, and was still partially in shock while trying to describe the boy, saying, "He looks like a little doll, wearing a long white shirt. He has dark hair." "Do you know where he lives?" the officer questioned. No, I don't, and I think there's something wrong with him." "Okay, Mum. Stay inside your house. We'll go look for him." Jill was frozen in her house for a while, and she couldn't relax, still insanely freaked out by what had transpired. She tried her best to remain calm, but this felt almost impossible. The image of the boy's dark eyes in that glazed stare and the slow motion of his movements flicked through her thoughts, and the hair on her arms raised. When she spotted the cops again, she quickly ran outside to ask if they had found him. "Yeah, we got him. It's fine. He's back with his parents now, don't worry," they said. "Is he going to do this again, or?" She felt she needed to know. "He's a bit troubled," was all the officer would say. Maybe he didn't want to disclose too much information about a minor, but in a lot of ways this was frustrating to Jill, who had a lot of questions racing through her thoughts. Who was this kid? Was he sleepwalking? Why did his parents let him leave in the middle of the night? Why did he have access to their kitchenware? She also wondered things like, does he do this a lot? Where does he live so I know where to look out? What if my elderly neighbour's back door had been unlocked when the boy tried the handle? There were a lot of unanswered questions, but the only response she was given was, "He's home now. Everything is safe." Jill ended up moving to a new neighbourhood within a year after this event took place, and she had a difficult time living in fear and anticipation of whether something like this would happen again. When my mum, Jill, told me this story years later as an adult, it really freaked me out, and honestly it still does. Whenever I find myself walking along the sidewalk at night in my suburb, especially if I'm alone, I imagined some little kid randomly peering at me from a dark passage between two houses, with a knife in hand. Now this TA was in my GCSE maths and science classes. Pretty much every female student in my year found this TA attractive, as he was young, maybe early 20s, and I also found him attractive. At first it was the usual TA help stuff, and I was very chatty, as of course I found him attractive, like most teen girls do when they find a teacher fit. They sort of act up and try to impress them, but it only started to get weird when the odd off-topic conversations occurred. The first odd thing was when our hair colours came up in conversation during maths class. He thought I'd said that my hair was black, and he said, "Your hair isn't black, it's brown." "No, your hair is black, not mine," I replied. "See, my girlfriend always says my hair is brown when it isn't. She's such a bitch." Something like that, I can't quite remember. And this was a red flag. I mean, talking about your girlfriend and swearing as a TA. Not professional at all. Then another day in maths class, a classmate blurted what I'd said aloud. "Oh my god, Sarah just said all the new TAs are so fit." And the TA went red and said something like, "Oh my." On another occasion, my friend who was in my science class pointed out how weird our TA was behaving. This was in physics class, and my physics teacher had us all sat around a table to show us a project, and the TA was stood between me and a classmate, and my friend was on my other side. I don't really recall how it happened, and I don't think the TA even realised until I'd moved my hand after 30 seconds, but he was sort of fiddling with my hand and arm. After class, my friend said, "Did you see how Sir was touching you?" Another time in maths class, the TA randomly came up to me and said, "You look better without makeup." "I'm not wearing any makeup," I said. "Yeah, you look better without it," he replied. Then towards the end of year 10, I found he was transferring to another school, so I asked, "Why are you leaving? You're my favourite TA." And he said, "I'll probably be back when you're in sixth form." He didn't come in for the last 2 weeks. Then on the last day of year 10, which was a non-school uniform day, I saw him. "Oh, what are you doing back here?" I said. "I came to see you." Oh, this was when I was lining up for English class. Then at the end of that lesson, I was coming down the stairs and exiting the building, and he was standing there with one of my friends talking to him. He saw me and I said, "Bye," along with some other things I don't remember. And he went in for a hug and I gave a spud. "I was going in for a hug," he said and laughed. "Oh," I giggled. Then I said goodbye and just left. There are many other strange things that happened between us. However, there are too many to write. These are just the worst and oddest of them. I've not seen him since, and I'm now at college. I realised how creepy this is, and was at the time, as I used to believe I was in love with this grown man. I still think he's very attractive, but I'm thrown off by how he used to talk to me when I was just 14 years old. So this all happened a couple of months ago when I decided to go for a ride on my four-wheeler. I would go on these rides almost every other night, if not every night. So I left my house and drove on some roads nearby, since I live in the country and not many people drive on these roads. After about 20 minutes, I realised how dark it was getting outside and turned around to head home. About 5 minutes passed and it was almost pitch black, so I really began to hurry up then, because I was still on this unknown road. I figured it was best for me to slow down and message my sister so she knew where I was, etc., and I didn't think anything else of the situation, as I was sitting on the road with fields of grass on both sides of it. But as I looked back up from my phone, I saw something, or in this case someone, walking out onto the road. I didn't have my glasses on, so I couldn't see it very well, and just passed it off as an animal. I started to drive towards the figure and realized it was a man at about 6'6", and he was just staring at me. I couldn't quite make any features out about the man, as I was still pretty far away, but I could definitely tell he was just looking at me. Since he was standing in the middle of the road though, I couldn't drive past, so I called out to him and asked if everything was all right and if he needed any help. However, since I was so far away and the four-wheeler was still running, I couldn't hear him and asked him to speak a little louder, but he didn't. So I got a little closer just in case he did actually need help. Now I was at a distance where there was no way I couldn't hear him, but I was still not in any danger. I asked him the question again and he shook his head no and reached out his hand. I insisted that I didn't get any closer and that I would like it if he stepped out of the way, but he shook his head no one more time and took a step closer to me. Now I keep a knife in my pocket, so I put my hand in there just in case, but he noticed this and put his hand down. I asked him one more time if he needed help, and if he didn't, could he please step out of the way, when he finally said, "Come," with a very deep raspy voice. I asked where he wanted me to go. And by the way, I'm 17 and 6'4", but I'm not a very muscular person, so anyone taller than me and had some sort of muscle mass kind of freaks me out a bit. He insisted that I follow him and left whatever I had in my pocket where it was, and I told him it was just a flashlight, and I didn't want to leave it there. He got upset that I wouldn't go with him, so he said something along the lines of, "Fine, you can leave then," and he stepped off to the side of the road. I took off as fast as I could, and when I passed I looked over at him. He looked so pissed off and yelled, "You're lucky this time, boy." I have no clue where he would have taken me though, as it was just empty fields both sides of me, or what would have happened if he had someone else with him, and I don't think I want to find out. I eventually got home and told my dad what had happened, and he didn't believe me, so he insisted that we went back onto the road the next day when it was light outside and see if we could find any trace of this man or any place he could have gone. So the next day at about 11 a.m, we took his truck and my four-wheeler back to do some searching. When we got there, we both got on the four-wheeler and drove around the fields, but didn't find anything. There were woods on the edges of the fields, but they were far out and we weren't going in them just in case, so we decided just to head back home. I haven't driven the four-wheeler out on the road since that day, because one, of that incident, and two, it's winter right now and it's really cold outside. I'm tempted to go back out on that route when it starts to warm up, but this time bring someone else with me, or wear a GoPro to document everything. Now, I've struggled with insomnia all my life, and when I was younger and it was untreated, I'd often stay up all night. And this particular story takes place in the mid-2010s, though I can't remember the exact year. At the time I didn't have a phone, so I spent my nights staring at my walls or creeping downstairs to watch the street for passing cars. The night this happened, it was around 8, so it wasn't exactly late. But I was home alone and knew I would be for the next few hours. I believe I either had my mother's phone with me or a computer to email if I needed, but I'm not sure. Now, I was no stranger to being home alone, was used to it and happy enough, but neither of my friends on the street were around, or I at least wasn't interested in spending time with them, so I walked to the park across the street alone. The way the park was situated was to the left side of the house, which was set at a corner on both streets. The park itself was pretty run down, and there was a small play structure made of wood, covered with graffiti, and not used much past dinner time. It was set at the top of a small hill, with a creek at the bottom, and me and the other kids my age spent a lot of time playing in and around it. Just outside the creek, on the other side of a thin line of trees, was a bench. Nobody used this bench, because nobody used the park, as it was in a place where you'd glance at it every once in a while, nervous in that way you are as a kid. I was the only one there, which was nothing new, and I spent a lot of time on top of the roof of the swirly slide, looking at the sky to kill time. At one point I looked at the bench and saw a silhouette, and for a moment I thought I'd imagined it. After a solid minute or so, I looked back and, well, it hadn't moved. It was shaped like an adult or an older teen, much taller than me and with more muscle. Not that that says much, as I've always been a bit shrimpy and petite. The person didn't move for ages, and I just kept watching, scared to get off the roof and run, and scared to look away. I'd say they were a man based on the sound of their voice, as they hummed to themselves the whole time. It was a song I knew but couldn't place, and still can't, as I can barely even remember what it sounded like now. It was a deeper octave, and while it could have been anyone, I think it was a man. This story doesn't have a big twist or anything, and I wasn't in danger. They never stood or came after me, but there was terror, and I don't think I've ever felt like that more than a few times in my life. That sort of full-body chill where every nerve shakes and spasms, and you're frozen in place. After about 10 minutes or maybe an hour, I have no idea. It just felt like an eternity. I slid off the slide roof and walked backwards towards my house. I could feel this person's eyes on me with each step, and still they never spoke a word. You couldn't see the bench from my house very well, and you needed to stand way at the edge of the side window and bend down awkwardly to look through the trees. I spent a very, very long time in that position watching, and they never moved. Once I'd gone to bed, I stopped thinking about it, and the fear had long faded. Part of me thinks it was just a stressed dad or something, listening to some music alone, which I can't fault, but I'm not sure, of course. Nevertheless, I found it creepy. I've been through some scary experiences, but this was the worst thing I feel that I've ever gone through in my life. I used to be a very naive, innocent kind of person. I was the type of optimist who believed there was a touch of goodness in every heart. A dangerous mindset to be in. I realise now that seeing the world through my rose-coloured glasses put a big, flashing red target on my back. Often when you think of scary stories involving creepy behaviour and psychological abuse, you think of an occurrence from a stranger. In my case, it came from my mother-in-law. My husband's mother initially adored me, not for any other reason than thinking that I could be easily controlled. I was meek with a passive personality, so it made sense that I would come across like someone who could be easily influenced. Looking back on it, I cringe at how creepy the situation really was, and for the sake of this story, I'll call my mother-in-law by the name of Mrs. Psycho. At the beginning of my relationship with my husband, Mrs. Psycho and I were getting along great, or so I thought. She'd take me shopping, give me compliments about my hair and girly stuff like that, and as the relationship with my partner grew more serious, she'd rant and rave to everyone in our neighbourhood about how much she adored me and how I was like the daughter she never had. So naturally I thought things were progressing positively. But certain things were just really off about Mrs. Psycho. I noticed little tidbits of her behaviour at parties and neighbourhood social gatherings. She'd sulk in a corner, and I'd chuck it up as her being socially awkward or anxious. But looking back at it now, I noticed that she was always whimpering about something negative going on in her life. How she fell off her bike and hurt her elbow while riding through a construction zone. How one neighbour complained about her parking in front of his house. Losing her job because she didn't get along with a co-worker. The list went on, and in every story she portrayed herself as a victim of some unusual circumstances. One huge red flag that my mind didn't understand at the time was the stories she was always telling about her other son, my partner's brother. She'd say some really disturbing things about how he'd held her, my partner and his dad hostage in their own home, and how he'd physically punched their father in the face. The way she described the story made it sound like my partner's brother was a bully to the whole family, and my partner didn't seem to think it was quite as severe as she made it sound. Regardless, in all her wild stories and accusations about him, she always scolded her son in ways that I just can't imagine ever scolding my own child. What my husband and I didn't fully interpret at the time was the underlying problem, which wasn't necessarily his brother, but the woman who had been driving a force for the insanity behind the behavior. Psychological abuse can trigger emotional responses in very unpredictable and disturbing ways. Mrs. Psycho's behavior became evidently creepy after our engagement. She showed signs of unhealthy enmeshment. First, she was angry that we didn't tell her immediately when we'd gotten engaged. Then she was angry when we changed the wedding date without first asking for her permission. She expressed a desire for my future husband and I to live in the upstairs of her house and pay her rent. We told her that we can afford our own home and we want to start a family, so that wouldn't work out. And the fury in her eyes was frightening. She would look normal one moment, then if you told her something she didn't want to hear, her eyes would turn black. The memory of her eyes still sends a frightening chill down my spine. From there, she became increasingly controlling. Mrs. Psycho and her husband, Mr. Psycho, would start showing up to our house every other day or so. I started counting how long they could go without having to see us, and that number came to 3 days. There was no privacy, and I felt that I had to close the curtains over our windows every night. I just had that uneasy feeling. I locked the bedroom door as a routine before bed, just to be on the extra safe side. Despite our relationship being pleasant in the beginning, I noticed that I was now feeling like I was treading on eggshells around Mrs. Psycho, or rather landmines. It seemed like anything I said was offensive to her, no matter how innocent. I realized I couldn't talk to her like I used to be able to when me and her son were just dating. I remembered when we'd be able to have nice, in-depth conversations, and I had allowed myself to be vulnerable with her. I confided in her about how I had a lot of social anxiety, and that her son came into my life during a time that I was suffering from crippling depression. I talked about how he'd brought a ray of sunshine into my life, thinking that speaking kindly about her son would please her. She just had this unfeeling, glazed look across her face. Hoping to mend my relationship with her, I decided to help her out one day with organizing her antiques. She had this hobby of going to auctions and buying and selling knickknacks, buttons and stuff like that. She would get very proud of her collections of things that I sort of thought were junk. But to be polite, I told her I saw beauty in these things, hoping to get back on her good side. There were some creepy dolls in the mix, including this horrifying-looking vampire doll with piercing red eyes. She said she'd had that doll for years and used to scare her sons with it when they were little kids. She laughed at the memory, and the sound had an eerie, satanical vibe to it. As if this wasn't enough to freak me out, she then told me this story about how a female co-worker complained about her to the HR department at her company. To seek revenge on this woman, Mrs. Psycho wrote a letter that was meant for the co-worker's husband, telling him that she was cheating on him. To remain as anonymous as possible, she told me how she slipped on a pair of black gloves and drove the letter to a faraway location so that her address couldn't be traced. I remember feeling very uneasy about her story, wondering how she could get angry enough to drive hours away just to cause emotional harm to another human being. There came a point after hearing this story when I didn't want to be left alone with my partner's mum anymore. My partner tried to talk to his parents about how I was feeling like I was on eggshells around them, but they flipped the narrative to say they were the ones feeling on eggshells around me. During this time, I painstakingly realized that psychological torture exists in the form of extreme invalidation. Not having your feelings acknowledged can really drive a person crazy. It was then when I felt a little more clued in to what may have happened to Mrs. Psycho's other son. I can't be sure because I never met the guy, but I think he was driven mad by his mother's severe emotional neglect. Now she was pulling the same tricks on me and my partner, gaslighting us into believing that we were just too sensitive. When my husband and I started figuring out that something was off, things got even creepier. His parents started showing up to our house to corner us into submission. What I mean is, they'd tell us stories to make them seem like the victims, so that we would give in to demands of what they wanted at the time. If we denied their requests, they'd use psychological manipulation by telling us that we were uncaring or ungrateful. One demonstration of this manipulation was when I became pregnant. I explained that the smell of pizza made me extremely sick, but this was ignored when Mrs. Psycho insisted that we go to a pizza restaurant for her birthday. I was confused with why I felt like I couldn't say no. My husband was in the same predicament. Somehow I think we sensed that something bad would happen to us if we declined. This is also because Mrs. Psycho's husband and her sister had contacted us, telling us explicitly that we weren't allowed to say no to her dinner invitations anymore. They explained it like, saying no hurts her feelings, but there was something else there that I can't quite explain. Something hidden beneath the surface that sounded really threatening. I had no idea why, but I just did not feel safe. Then only 2 weeks after giving birth to our daughter, I had the creepiest interaction of my life. Mrs. Psycho caught me alone while I was on my front porch. The weather was really nice, so I was rocking with my baby in one of our outdoor chairs. She came up to the doorstep and assumed a seat in a chair next to me. Then in a quiet, ominous voice, she said to me, "You have to share her, you know." Her black eyes flicked to the infant in my arms. I know what you might be thinking, but this wasn't said in a cute, excited, new grandma kind of way. Her voice sounded cold and possessive, with certain passive-aggressive intent behind the statement. I naturally clutched my arms around my daughter tighter, feeling a protective instinct take over me. Mrs. Psycho had expressed to me before that she'd always wanted to have a daughter, but was only ever able to have sons. Maybe I was being influenced by the postpartum hormones, or just overall feeling paranoid, but a disturbing thought occurred to me that she might want to get rid of me somehow to have my daughter to herself. I later told my husband about the bizarre interaction with his mum, and how I couldn't keep up with the heavy psychological demands of his parents anymore. It was all taking a strange emotional toll on me, as well as a strain on our marriage, and I still couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Nevertheless, they were causing us a lot of stress, which was impacted on me all the more while I was trying to adapt to my role as a new mother. They even restricted me in bizarre ways, telling me I wasn't allowed to refer to our daughter as my baby. I had previously posted on Facebook about how excited and happy I was to be a new mom. I posted a side-by-side picture of me with my daughter with the caption, "She has my eyes," which was meant to be light-hearted and innocent. But my mother-in-law commented on the post with, "My son had something to do with it too," which not only put a dampener on the mood, but also felt creepy. Like, why did she have to mention something we already know? It was almost as if my happiness made her all the more enraged. I really felt like I was starting to go crazy. The stress was enough to make me physically sick. At first, my husband hesitated when I told him about my concerns, stating the usual spiel that was natural for him to say, that they were his parents and he couldn't just drop contact with them. But something in his voice contained fear, and it wouldn't take long before he would realize how messed up the situation actually was. The incident that drove him to the point of cutting off his parents happened when they cornered us in our own living room, demanding that we watch their unruly dog while they went on vacation for 5 days. My husband almost caved, but stayed firm when he told them, "No, we can't. We have a 2-month-old baby to look after." The murderous glare his mum then flashed at me was intense, and enough to make me crawl out of my skin. You know that look someone gives before they are about to attack? It looked like something like that from the movies, very primal and hateful. I thought for sure that she was about to lunge at me and wring her hands around my neck, causing me death by strangulation. I was terrified. Mr. and Mrs. Psycho eventually left our house, but they were clearly angry that they weren't able to convince us to conform to their will. My husband and I had a dark, suspicious feeling that something bad was about to happen. First, we received lengthy emails from Mrs. Psycho, mostly insulting me. She said she thought that I was brainwashing her son, and she went on to portray herself as a victim. She used the knowledge of my anxiety disorder to make an argument that I was mentally unstable and dangerous. She threatened to post about me on Facebook and make our life a living hell if we didn't apologize for deviating from what she wanted. At the same time, she told me that I was dead to her and listed all the mistakes I've ever made in the past, as well as criticizing my faults. I'd be lying if I said this didn't sting. My husband and I needed space to recover from the emotional wounds that she had inflicted on us. We remained silent, not wanting to engage with her any further. My husband and I were pretty scared as well as being hurt, spending most of our days cooped up in our bedroom, not knowing what to expect. But we stayed strong through the process of separating from the toxic relationship. Mrs. Psycho proceeded to make good on her threat, posting about me publicly on Facebook. She said I was batshit crazy. She even went a step further, saying that I had borderline personality disorder, all in capital letters. This completely came out of nowhere. She knew I had anxiety, but I'd never mentioned anything to her about being borderline, because I wasn't diagnosed with that at all. It didn't end there, though. An active smear campaign against me ensued, as Mr. and Mrs. Psycho actually went door to door to everyone's house in my community, posing as good citizens to warn everyone about their extremely dangerous, manipulative, 5-foot-tall daughter-in-law. My neighbours didn't react the way that was expected, though. They were more wary of her than me. So instead of ruining my reputation, which was the desired effect, most people in my neighbourhood were majorly creeped out by Mrs. Psycho's efforts. They were equally creeped out by Mr. Psycho's willingness to go along with the whole thing. I guess after years of being beaten down with his wife's abuse, he was just an empty shell of a man, a flying monkey to the proverbial wicked witch. There are a few doctors and therapists in my neighbourhood who couldn't officially diagnose her, since she wasn't their patient, but they said off the record they believed that Mrs. Psycho may have been projecting, meaning that she was, in essence, confessing that she is potentially dangerous and volatile while pinning it on me. This, along with some stories of Mrs. Psycho's interactions with other people in our neighbourhood, confirmed that something was disturbingly off with this lady. This information made the situation all the more unsettling when Mr. and Mrs. Psycho showed up to our house for what we suspected would be a confrontation. My husband and I were watching Survivor in the living room with our baby when the doorbell rang. He crept to the front window to peer behind the curtain to see who it was. I could see the fear on his face. "It's my parents," he said, and my blood ran cold. I immediately ran with the baby upstairs, pausing only to tell him that it was his choice whether to answer the door or not, since they're his parents, but that me and the baby would be hidden away. As I made my way up the stairs, my husband hovered by the front door, conflicted. He didn't know what to do. Meanwhile, I could hear jostling at the front door, like his parents were trying to force their way inside our house with a spare key. I thank God to this day that we had just changed the locks a few days before so they couldn't get in. I proceeded to run upstairs and closed the bedroom door behind me, locking me and the baby in. I held my daughter close, my heart thudding wildly against my chest, when there was a knock on the bedroom door. I reacted with a jolt. It absolutely terrified me. My husband's voice on the other side calmed me down, though, and he told me he didn't answer the door. He was trembling when I unlocked the door to let him in, and his face was pale. He showed me a text message from his dad saying, "Anyone home?" followed by another text from his mother saying later, "You're a coward hiding behind your keyboard." I don't know what would have happened if my husband had chosen to answer the door, but I shuddered to think about it. My husband and I both blocked them after that. Phone numbers, social media accounts, everything. They moved away to another state, thank God, and we have since had no contact with his parents for almost 2 years, and our daughter is growing in a loving environment, free of toxicity. Sadly, we have to block some of my husband's other family because they kept telling us we should talk to my in-laws, which, by the way, feels a lot like being told, please contact your abuser. For this reason, I sometimes feel like it would have almost been better to be physically abused than mentally abused, because then there would be some form of visible evidence of the harm that they had inflicted. In the meantime, they have so far made no attempts to contact us with an apology or anything. Instead, they once reached out with a nasty, have a shitty anniversary, you two are a match made in hell, which only further secured our decision to cut contact with them. I have since armed myself with knowledge so that I will be less naive about creepy behavior in the future. I've studied up on narcissism and the negative psychological impact that some people can have on others through gaslighting and invalidation. I hope everyone listening out there may be aware that not all abuse is physical. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.